Everyone at the gala thought he was just a driver, until Oprah stood up and revealed the truth. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. New York's Lincoln Center shimmered with a grandeur that could blind humility. Under a dome of chandeliers and symphonies of polished laughter, the nation's most powerful names gathered: billionaires, political elites, medical pioneers, and cultural icons, each dressed like the future America was stitched into their gowns and tuxedos. The gala was more than an event. It was a statement that the country's broken healthcare system could still be reborn if the right people put their names and their money behind it. Cameras flickered as black sedans rolled up like royalty. Names were whispered like sacred mantras. Invitations were gold embossed. Entry required not just approval, but alignment. Alignment with a narrative. Innovation, vision, credentials. The night wasn't about healing the sick. It was about who would get the credit for doing it. A tall man stepped quietly out of a rideshare, not a limo. His suit was clean, but clearly from another decade. His face familiar, but not in the current context. No entourage, no red carpet posture. He walked with quiet purpose toward the velvet ropes, holding nothing but a folded invitation and a calm, unreadable expression. The security team hesitated. So did the assistant at the check-in booth. She whispered something into her headset, her eyes flickering with polite confusion. Then came the voice. Smooth, commanding, honed through decades of media war rooms and political debates. "Excuse me," said Arianna Huffington, stepping forward in a slate-gray gown that shimmered like silver armor. "This section is for keynote guests. Perhaps logistics can guide him to the community seating." The crowd glanced over, uncertain whether to laugh. Some already were. "He's probably here to deliver something," she added, not loudly, but just enough. The man didn't flinch. He handed his invitation to the scanner. A soft beep. A line of green text lit up on the screen. VIP. Priority access. Confirmed. Arianna's smile faltered. "Must be a clerical oversight," she said flatly. "Someone should double-check credentials. We can't afford symbolic appearances tonight." The assistant nodded, pretending to type something, but it was too late. The man had already passed through the gates. No fanfare. No protest. Just silence. Inside the ballroom, the air thickened with prestige. Gold leaf centerpieces. Crystal wine towers. Every seat aligned with an algorithm of influence. At table 1, the inner sanctum, Arianna took her place with former senators, Ivy League deans, CEOs of pharmaceutical giants. And there he was, already seated. Same old jacket. Same quiet eyes. Hands resting neatly beside a glass of still water. Arianna paused. For a moment, she didn't sit. Her hand brushed her nameplate. She turned to the guest beside her, a biotech billionaire from Palo Alto. "Would you believe," she said with a half-laugh, "that man once ran a state government? California, if you can imagine." The billionaire smirked, unsure if he should. "I suppose lifting dumbbells teaches a lot about public policy these days," she added, reaching for her champagne. The man didn't look up. He didn't answer. He simply unfolded the gala program and began reading quietly, as if her words were traffic noise outside a distant window. Arianna leaned slightly toward him, lowering her voice but sharpening its tone. "You should know, this isn't a nostalgia convention. People here expect more than muscle memory." Still no reaction. Across the table, a young surgeon exchanged a glance with a journalist. Whispers began, not in ridicule, but in curiosity. Some were wondering, now, who the man really was. Others remembered vague headlines from years ago. An immigrant, a champion, a governor. Then silence. Because sometimes it isn't the loudest voice that commands a room. It's the one that refuses to speak on cue. The music softened as waiters moved through the ballroom like chess pieces. Chatter returned, measured and polite, as if the earlier tension had been folded neatly under the silverware. But at table 1, the air remained strange, lopsided, as if the presence of a man who didn't belong had tilted the axis of something sacred. Arianna Huffington sat stiffly, her posture elegant but charged. Her fingers traced the rim of her glass as she studied the man beside her. He hadn't touched his wine. He hadn't said a word. He had simply returned her remarks with silence, too calm to be dismissive, too quiet to be weak. And that somehow unnerved her more than any rebuttal. She smiled faintly and leaned toward the biotech executive across from her. You know, there was a time when this country confused charisma for competence. We put entertainers in charge of economies and thought muscle could replace mastery. The executive chuckled, a low, diplomatic noise. He wasn't sure if she was referring to a policy debate or the man sitting beside her. Neither was safe to ask. Arianna tapped the edge of her tablet. Sliding open a private archive, there was an old headline from 2005. Asterisk, Huffington blasts Schwarzenegger's budget cuts. Governments can't be bench pressed into shape. Asterisk, she remembered that interview vividly. She had delivered those lines on national television with the clarity of a scalpel. California was bleeding back then. Crippled by debt, schools collapsing, healthcare programs gutted. And there he was, the former Mr. Universe, smiling through the press like solutions were just a few push-ups away. To her, it wasn't personal. It was structural. America had lost its sense of rigor. Expertise had become negotiable. And Arnold, he had become the poster boy for that downfall. When he won the recall election in 2003, Arianna had been a contender. She had shared debate stages with him, shared panels, shared cameras, but not the same language. He spoke in grit. She spoke in systems. And while the public fell for the immigrant dream, the accent, the underdog charm, she knew what was missing: policy, preparation, plan. After he won, she didn't resent him. She resented what he represented. That knowledge, vision, and decades of civic work could be outvoted by a bicep and a one-liner. Now here he was again, at her table, at her gala. After all these years, Arianna took a slow sip of champagne. Her voice dipped, conversational but lined with flint. I must admit, she said toward the table, I didn't expect a former governor to still dress like someone waiting outside the gym. A few polite laughs. One guest awkwardly adjusted his cufflinks. Another reached for the breadbasket just to avoid eye contact. The man didn't react. She pressed on. There's a reason this table was curated, she added, gesturing gently. We wanted voices that shaped real change. Legislation, infrastructure, reform. Still nothing. Across the room, a young attendee from a health nonprofit glanced over. His eyes locked on Arnold's face, then quickly flicked away. He whispered something to the woman beside him. She stiffened, then nodded slowly. Arianna noticed. She hated noticing. She turned slightly in her seat, keeping her expression smooth. Some people forget that governing isn't a film set, she said, her smile icy. You don't get to yell cut and start over when the budget fails. The man finally moved, just slightly. He reached into his inside pocket and pulled out a folded slip of paper. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't performative. He unfolded it with the care of someone handling something old, something earned. It was a receipt, yellowed, handwritten, dated from over a decade ago. It bore the stamp of a hospital in East Los Angeles. Paid in full. Next to it, a sticky note with a single line, asterisk, do not name donor. Asterisk, he placed it beside his water glass and said nothing. Arianna's mouth opened, then shut. Someone across the table exhaled. The moment passed, but it stayed. Because some things don't need to be said. They just need to be remembered. The lights dimmed just enough to shift the mood. A hush spread across the hall, the kind that ripples through a crowd not from fear, but expectation. On the massive screen behind the stage, a soft piano began to play. The MC stepped forward with well-rehearsed empathy and introduced the centerpiece of the night, a short documentary on the state of America's collapsing healthcare system. No one clapped. Not yet. They just watched. The video opened with footage from the streets of Philadelphia, then San Francisco. Men and women barely conscious, slumped against brick walls, their bodies twisted in unnatural stillness. Their arms bore the telltale signs of opioid addiction, needle tracks and bruises faded to violet. Some were twitching, some weren't moving at all. Narration spoke softly over the visuals, but it didn't need to say much. The images had already done the work. A homeless veteran trying to get insulin. A single mother turned away from urgent care because she didn't have the right form of ID. A child sitting quietly on a hospital bench, holding an empty asthma inhaler, while her mother argued at reception. The music swelled. The screen showed a map of America, dotted with red XS. Hospitals that had closed in the past 5 years. Rural towns. Urban neighborhoods. Even suburbs. One by one, the lights blinked out. At table one, no one touched their food. Arianna sat very still, her eyes fixed forward, but her fingers curled slightly on the tablecloth. These images, these numbers, they were meant to validate her work, her cause, her policies. She had built the narrative that the system was collapsing because leaders had been reckless, underqualified, ill-prepared. People who thought running a gym gave them the tools to run a state. She knew exactly who that message was for. And so did he. She didn't look at him, but she could feel his presence. Steady, calm, too calm. The documentary shifted tones. Now it focused on the victims left behind. A woman in Detroit who gave birth on the floor of a hospital lobby. A nurse in Tennessee who was told to reuse gloves. A man in San Diego who watched his wife die on a gurney in the hallway because there were no ICU beds left. The audience was silent. No one whispered. No one laughed. And then it happened, just for a second, a shot of a shuttered community clinic flashed on screen. It was a small building in South Central Los Angeles, graffitied now, windows broken. But for Arnold, it wasn't just another failed address. He knew that door. He had walked through it 16 years ago. Not as a politician. As a man. No one else reacted. But he remembered the smell of bleach and old leather chairs. He remembered the woman crying in the hallway because her husband, a mechanic, couldn't afford a specialist. He remembered sitting down with the clinic's exhausted director and offering to cover 3 months' rent. Anonymously, quietly. She cried, then promised not to tell. Now it was gone. The screen faded to black. A quote appeared in white letters. Asterisk. You can measure a nation's strength not by its armies, but by who it chooses to keep alive. Asterisk soft applause rose, uneven and restrained. Some wiped tears. Some just sat, blinking. Arianna broke the silence first. We've come far, she said smoothly, turning toward her side of the table. But we must acknowledge how we got here. A pause. Then she looked directly at the man beside her. We trusted the wrong hands with the steering wheel. And now we're all paying the fare. A few guests nodded. One or two gave a small, murmured M&M, but others hesitated, because the images hadn't pointed fingers. They had pointed mirrors. The man didn't speak. He simply placed his hand flat on the table, fingers brushing the yellowed hospital receipt, still resting beside his glass. The gesture was so slight, so simple, that most missed it. But one person noticed, a young doctor in training from New Jersey, sitting 2 tables away. He leaned over to his mentor and whispered, "That's him, isn't it?" His mentor replied softly, "I think so." And just like that, a question began to flicker. Not just, what is he doing here? But what has he already done? Because silence, when it comes from a man with nothing left to prove, echoes louder than any speech. Dinner service resumed with a kind of forced elegance. Forks clinked, napkins were refolded, and servers moved like stagehands in a drama no one quite understood anymore. The string quartet resumed something light, a melody chosen to soothe discomfort. But at table one, the dissonance couldn't be undone. Arianna straightened her silverware. She had mastered this kind of recovery. When the room shifted, when the tension threatened the narrative, she knew how to steer it back. She leaned into her voice, the kind that once won elections and sold movements. Soft, sharp, polished. "You know," she said to no one in particular. Though her tone made it clear, leadership isn't just about intention. It's about outcome. A good heart doesn't rebuild hospitals. Data does. Planning does. Real sacrifice of ego or performance. Her knife glided through a piece of salmon, as if her words needed punctuation. The man beside her didn't move. Still no response. A guest across the table. a former health policy advisor, offered a quick nod in support. Another chuckled under his breath, attempting lightness. Next we'll hear he built a clinic with protein shakes and elbow grease, he said. A few laughed, not many, not loudly. The young doctor in training from the previous chapter leaned in again, whispering to his colleague, I think that's really him. His voice held a kind of, oh, that wasn't fan worship. It was something closer to recognition. Reverence. Arianna noticed. She always noticed. She had built a career watching rooms turn, and she could feel this one slipping, inch by inch, not through confrontation, but erosion. She tapped her glass lightly, signaling for attention. Let me offer a toast, she said, rising slowly. Her chair scraped the floor, an imperfect sound in a perfect room. To the ones who stayed in the fight, to the people who gave up book deals and TED Talks and television specials in exchange for actual solutions. She raised her glass. And to the ones who didn't mistake fame for service. Glasses clinked, but not all at once. Some paused, some glanced. Then came the moment no one expected. A young woman at the far end of the room, barely 30, dressed simply, her name tag bearing no title, stood up. She looked unsure of herself, but she cleared her throat and spoke loud enough for the nearest tables to hear. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for him. The room stilled. She pointed, slowly, to the man Arianna had spent the last hour dismantling. I was 12 when my mom collapsed outside a Rite Aid in Bakersfield. No insurance. No savings. She had stage 2 lymphoma and didn't even know it. A hush fell like snowfall. They turned her away twice. The third time, someone paid for her biopsy, for her treatment. Quietly, an anonymous donor. We never found out who it was. Until I saw that photo in the lobby. She pulled something from her purse. A folded piece of paper. A news clipping. A photo of Arnold standing beside the same clinic, smiling awkwardly in a windbreaker, his name nowhere on the plaque. I'm not a doctor yet, she said, her voice breaking. But I'm here. And my mom lived, because someone we all dismissed didn't dismiss us. She sat down. No applause. Just breath. Sharp, silent, collective. Arianna didn't move. For the first time, her hands shook. Not from anger, not from nerves, but from something far rarer. Displacement. Because she knew what that story meant. In one moment, the balance had tipped. The narrative she had built, the room she had curated, the assumptions she had layered, all had cracked. The man in the weathered suit remained seated. He looked at the young woman, nodded once, then returned his glass of water, as if the past hadn't just stood up and spoken his name. A guest 3 seats away pushed their chair back and stood. Another followed, then a third. One by one, scattered, without coordination, people rose, not to applaud, not perform, but to recognize, to see. And Arianna stayed seated, because even the most powerful voice cannot compete with truth told quietly. Truth that doesn't demand the mic, doesn't rewrite history, just stands in it. Sometimes all it takes to flip a room is a name not spoken, but remembered. A murmur moved through the ballroom like a wind catching fire. Chairs shifted. Glasses clinked nervously. The speechless kind of tension had settled in, the kind where people knew they had seen something they weren't supposed to ignore. No announcement had been made, no formal introduction, but everyone now knew who the man in the old suit was, or at least who they had forgotten he could be. Arnold remained still, not proud, not embarrassed, simply present. He hadn't defended himself. He hadn't corrected Arianna. And somehow, that made every word she'd said echo louder now, not in victory, but in contrast. The MC returned to the stage, her voice a little softer than before, as if she too had been caught off guard by the shift in energy. Before we continue the final awards, she said, we've invited one of tonight's guests to share a few words, a reflection, really, on why we're all here. She didn't say his name. She didn't have to. Arnold stood slowly, not with the stiffness of ceremony, but with the groundedness of someone used to heavy things. The room quieted. Phones were lowered. Forks set down. Even Arianna didn't speak. He stepped up to the mic. For a few seconds, he said nothing. Then he looked out at the sea of polished faces, at the polished walls, the chandeliers dripping elegance, and began. I wasn't born in this country. His voice was low, thick, unmistakable. I came here with an accent, with $20. I slept on a park bench once because I didn't want my parents to know I was failing. I worked construction by day and cleaned a gym at night just to keep my membership. He paused. I remember being hungry, not movie star hungry, real hungry. The kind that makes you cut apples into thin slices, so it feels like more. A quiet laugh rippled through a few rows, not from humor, but recognition. I came to America for the dream, not the red carpets, not the cameras. The real one, the one you have to fight for with everything you have. He looked over the audience, but his gaze wasn't challenging. It was remembering. I became a champion, then an actor, then a politician. I've stood behind podiums. I've signed bills. I've vetoed them, too. And in all that time, people have told me who I was supposed to be. He glanced briefly at Arianna, then back to the room. But the hardest thing I've ever done in my life wasn't winning a title. It wasn't running for office. It was walking into a hospital in South Los Angeles and realizing that nobody cared who I was, only whether someone could pay. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the same folded hospital receipt he had placed on the table earlier. Slowly, he opened it again. This is from 2008. I paid for a stranger's surgery that day. No cameras, no interviews, just a clinic about to shut down and a man with pain in his chest. He was a veteran. Nobody knew his name, but I couldn't forget his face. He held the paper up for a moment, then placed it gently on the podium. I've done this over and over for years, quietly, because I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I was trying to sleep at night. Silence. Thick. Reverent. Arnold continued. There are people in this room who understand real power. It's not a headline. It's not applause. It's the ability to make something happen and choosing not to demand credit for it. He looked down for a second, and when he raised his head again, his voice had changed. Softer. More vulnerable. My brother died when we were young. He drank too much. Car accident. In Austria, we didn't have resources back then. We didn't talk about mental health. We didn't talk about pain at all. He swallowed. I promised myself I would never let someone suffer silently if I could do something about it. So that's what I've tried to do, even if no one noticed. Even if people thought I was just another actor looking for a spotlight. He looked out again, and this time his voice held steel. I didn't come here to defend my past. I came because the future is bleeding, because I walked past too many people on sidewalks, shaking, fading, forgotten, and I won't keep pretending that's someone else's job to fix. One heartbeat passed, then another, then someone stood. It wasn't Oprah. It wasn't a senator. It was a dishwasher in a white shirt and black vest, standing quietly at the back of the room, hand resting over his heart. Then came a nurse. Then came a donor. Then, row by row, seat by seat, people rose, not out of obligation, but because something in them refused to stay seated. Arianna didn't move. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, knuckles pale. Her eyes fixed on the floor, blinking but not seeing. The narrative she had spent years building, about influence, credibility, control, was cracking, and there was no rebuttal strong enough to stop it. Arnold didn't bow. He didn't smile. He simply stepped down from the podium and returned to his seat, passing the hospital receipt to a young woman near the aisle. She took it like it was gold, because in that moment the room did not return to normal. It couldn't, not after what had just unfolded. The air, once filled with curated charm and polished hierarchy, now held something heavier. Realization, reverence, a quiet reordering of everything people thought they knew. Arnold had sat down again, hands resting calmly on the table, as if he hadn't just redrawn the moral center of the entire evening. He didn't look around to see who was watching. He didn't need to, because in truth, they all were. Some with shame, some with awe, some still struggling to reconcile the man before them with the man they thought they had already defined. The MC returned to the stage. Her voice, once light and rehearsed, now carried a tremble she didn't bother to hide. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, pausing to find her words, "we'd like to take a moment to recognize an extraordinary contributor to this movement. A figure who has asked repeatedly not to be named tonight. But after what we've just witnessed, silence would feel like denial." She turned slightly, scanning the crowd. "You may know his name. You may know his past. But what you don't know is what he's done, quietly, persistently, for years behind the scenes." There was no drum roll, no spotlight, just a subtle dimming of the house lights and the rising hum of strings from the quartet in the corner. "Please welcome to the stage," she said, "Miss Oprah Winfrey." The crowd shifted again, respectfully, anticipation tinged with reverence. Oprah stepped into view like a wave moving toward shore, measured, graceful, unavoidable. She took the mic without notes, without a script, and waited for the room to settle. "I wasn't planning to speak tonight," she began, "but sometimes moments happen that demand your full voice." She looked toward table one, toward him. "I've spent my life interviewing the most powerful, the most brilliant, the most complicated people on this earth. But let me tell you something. Real power doesn't speak in volume. It speaks in presence, in what you do when nobody's watching." She paused. "There's a man in this room who has personally funded the reopening of 14 community clinics in states that never even voted for him. He sent mobile treatment vans to cities where his name isn't on a single building. He's paid medical bills for strangers who would never know why their hospital debt disappeared. And he never once asked for a headline. No one moved. Until tonight, very few people knew. And that was intentional, because he believed and still believes that dignity matters more than credit." She turned her body fully now, facing Arnold without theatrics, just truth. "Arnold Schwarzenegger," she said softly, "you are the quiet architect of one of the largest private healthcare reinvestments in this country's history." The applause was slow at first, not because people were hesitant, but because it took them a moment to adjust, like walking into sunlight after hours in the dark. Then it built, row after row, clap by clap, not thunderous, steady, respectful, lasting. Arnold didn't stand, not immediately. He only looked toward Oprah, nodded once, then slowly rose, not to bask, but to acknowledge. As he did, someone from the tech industry at the back lifted their phone, not a post, but to record for their own memory, something to replay later, to remind themselves what humility actually looked like. And that was when it happened. A folded piece of paper arrived at Arianna's side. A waiter handed it to her, without eye contact. She opened it. 5 words. "Please stop. He's the owner." Her chest tightened. She read it again. "Owner?" She scanned the room. No one had told her. She had been the one to reject his early proposals for a partnership, the one who had told her board, years ago, that aligning with him would make their work less serious, the one who'd laughed on camera when asked about his influence in healthcare. And now he wasn't just a guest. He was a quiet engine behind the entire evening. Her hands trembled. She folded the paper slowly, as if doing it too quickly might draw attention. She looked up at him, still standing, still calm. He wasn't looking at her. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't even aware. Or maybe he was. Maybe he'd known all along exactly how this would unfold. Not with vengeance. With clarity. Oprah stepped back as the music swelled gently again. Arnold sat. The MC returned and attempted to resume the program, but the crowd wasn't ready. They were still recalibrating. And Arianna sat in the middle of it all, no longer at the center, because in a room full of voices, the one that had spoken loudest had done so without ever raising its volume. The music played again, but it no longer sounded like celebration. It sounded like a soft apology, echoing through a room that had finally realized it had mistaken the weight of man. Conversations resumed here and there in small, uncertain pockets. People smiled politely, but their eyes kept drifting toward table one, toward him, toward the man who hadn't come to take the spotlight, but who had become the center of gravity anyway. Arnold remained seated, his hands folded quietly in his lap, He didn't reach for his phone. He didn't check the program. He just sat still, as if the applause and recognition had already passed through him and evaporated. To him, the moment was never about being seen. It was about what had already been done, what no one had seen. At her end of the table, Arianna hadn't moved. She kept her posture intact, chin high, hands resting just above the place setting, as if protocol could still shield her. But she wasn't in the spotlight anymore. The light had shifted, not away from her, but through her, transparent. She was visible, but no longer the subject, present but peripheral. She glanced around the table, looking for someone to meet her gaze, someone to anchor her back to the version of herself that had once commanded every room. But no one looked, not directly. Some nodded politely. Others turned back to their food. A few rose from their seats, whether to refill a drink or to find fresh air. She didn't know, but their backs said more than their faces. Arianna reached for her clutch, not out of necessity, but reflex. She opened it slowly, checked her phone. 12 unread messages. 2 from reporters. 1 from her communications director. Another from an old colleague. "What happened?" the text read. She didn't answer, because even if she had the words, the room had already written its own story, and she wasn't the author anymore. Across the ballroom, a photographer adjusted his lens. For years, he had made a career capturing faces like hers, the composed, the untouchable, the center of gravity. But tonight, his camera pointed in another direction, toward a man in a worn suit, shaking hands with nurses and nonprofit volunteers. He didn't pose. He didn't linger. He just listened. Arnold's face was half lit by the chandelier above, his expression unreadable but steady. It was a face of someone who had carried more than anyone guessed, and asked for nothing in return. Not applause, not forgiveness, just silence, and a little space to keep doing the work. When he began to rise from his seat, no one called out his name. No one asked for a speech. They just watched. Even the orchestra seemed to slow. He moved quietly through the crowd, offering nods, small smiles. He shook the hand of a young doctor in training, who had spoken up earlier. He placed a hand on the shoulder of the woman, whose mother had been saved by a silent donation. He passed Arianna without pause. She turned slightly as if to speak, maybe to apologize, maybe to explain. But he didn't stop. He didn't even glance, not out of malice, but because the moment had already passed. Outside the gala doors, the night was cooler now. The city hummed, oblivious. Cars moved, lights changed, and somewhere nearby, another person lay curled beneath a bus stop bench, lost between the cracks of a broken system. Arnold stood on the steps for a moment, inhaling deeply, like someone letting go of something heavy. Not regret, not pride, just the weight of having said enough. Inside, the program resumed. Speeches, fundraising numbers, champagne poured again. The night tried to reclaim its rhythm, but it never quite did, because when a room shifts this deeply, the aftershock lingers. Arianna remained in her seat, her spine straight but her breath shallow. She looked at the empty chair beside her, the one he had occupied, and realized for the first time that silence can leave a louder echo than words ever could. Later, long after the event ended, guests would talk, not about the decor, not about the wine, but about the moment the gala forgot its agenda and remembered its purpose. The moment the cameras weren't pointed at power, but at principle. And the man who had once been mocked for speaking with an accent became the most fluent voice in the room, without raising it. And in a world full of noise where everyone is desperate to be heard, he reminded them that real power doesn't demand attention. It earns silence,